Well, it took me a while to see this movie, but I finally saw it, and yeah, pretty much everything everybody's already said about this movie is true. Puss in Boots. The Last Wish. So Puss in Boots The Last Wish is the latest installment in the Shrek franchise. You know, that franchise whose last installment was Shrek Forever After from, I don't even remember how many years ago that came out. But this is not the first time we've had a Puss in Boots spin-off. There was a Puss in Boots movie that came out and it did fine. It was okay. I saw it and I really do think fine is the perfect word to describe that movie. It wasn't terrible. It didn't destroy the Shrek franchise or even the character of Puss in Boots himself. But for me, it didn't live up to the hype of the Puss in Boots that we got in Shrek 2, because Shrek 2, in my opinion, is the best Shrek. You can fight me on that all you want. I'm not changing my mind. I love Shrek 2 so much. And Puss in Boots is a big part of that because he's the cat version of Zorro. He's even voiced by Zorro, Antonio Banderas. And you know me, I've got a soft spot for that old school swashbuckling adventure type hero, and Puss in Boots is the Shrek universe version of that. And I was really excited to see what they could do with this character, give him his own movie. And what we got was this just kind of fine by the numbers children's movie with Humpty Dumpty, and I feel like I should love that movie a lot more than I actually do, because Humpty Dumpty was one of those nursery rhymes that I just always loved as a kid. I don't know why, it's actually kind of a sad story, but for whatever reason I was obsessed with Humpty Dumpty when I was like a toddler, and I still have a soft spot for that. So Puss in Boots should have won me over immediately, but it really didn't. And now we finally have a sequel to that that's kind of a sequel, also kind of a spin-off from Shrek, and it really works a lot better than the first movie did, and even I would argue Shrek's 3 and 4 did. Because for me, this is the first time I've seen the Shrek universe capitalize on the fairy tale nature of its world since Shrek 2. I think Shrek 2, there were so many references and quips and little gags of movies and fairy tales and pop culture that were just sprinkled throughout. And while that's there throughout pretty much every Shrek movie, they really got the timing down, the style down in Shrek 2. And this movie carries that tradition. The jokes come fast and furious, the references even faster and even more furious-er. But that's, for me, part of the fun of this movie. You get these little quips and references. If you recognize it, great. If not, it doesn't distract from the story, which is something that I think a lot of movies that like to have this type of sense of humor miss out on when they have these references and pop culture things. And it's that a movie has to be more than just references. References for the sake of references will be fine for like 30 minutes, but after that it just kind of gets old. This movie has a plot, has character, has all the great things that I would want in this type of adventure story. So let's get down to the story. So the story is about Puss in Boots, as we've seen him in other movies, and he's lived quite a life. In fact, he's lived 8 of them because he's a cat, he's got 9 lives, and he's on his 9th life at the start of this movie. And for a cat, that's a big deal because we meet our first villain of this story, and it's the embodiment of death itself as this big bad wolf character. And I just think that's perfect voice, perfect character design, just perfect character in general. I love this guy. He's a fantastic villain. He just kind of stalks Puss throughout the whole movie. He is not gonna stop until he gets Puss for cheating him out of 8 deaths. So he's really on this revenge quest to destroy Puss in Boots. And it's great. It's great character motivation. It's in character with the embodiment of death. I love it. But Puss, played again by Antonio Banderas, is on his own quest to find the wishing star that crashed to Earth, and now you gotta find it. You gotta find this map. And when he gets to the star, he gets his one wish, and his one wish is just to get all of his lives back, to start fresh, clean slate. Now he can be the legend again who laughs in the face of death and can kind of flaunt it in front of everybody again. And that's really what I love about the heart of this story. The heart of this story is a tale as old as time. It's a person, or I guess in this case it's a cat, grappling with his own mortality. And for a PG animated family friendly little romp that came out in December right at the end of the year, I was not expecting much from this movie. And to have a core story as profound as that is shockingly good. And I am really impressed at the people that made this movie, because they did not just push this out, rush it when the first movie came out. They took their time and developed a story that is actually good and that has lessons for both children and parents. And I just love to see that. Can we get more movies for kids like that, please, that have deep, profound things that the parents can latch onto? But anyway, Puss is not alone in this quest. He meets up with his old flame kitty Softpaws, and she's played once again by Salma Hayek. And she's really the only connection that brings us back to the first Puss in Boots movie. But really, I'm perfectly fine with just writing that movie off completely, because you don't really need to have seen that to understand what's going on. She comes into the story and you get that she was an old flame, that he left her and went off to be an adventurer, and she's kind of scorned by that. And now that I think about it, that is a lot like Marion's introduction in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they clearly have a past. It's right there on the screen. You don't need a movie to set that up. You didn't need it for Indiana Jones. You don't really need it for Puss in Boots. So really, this movie, if you want the Puss in Boots experience, all you need is this. But her whole thing is that since she's lived a life of adventuring and crime and thieving, she wants to find someone that she can actually trust. And that's her wish. And over the course of this movie, she realizes that, well, maybe that could be Puss. Maybe something can reignite the romance that they had. Maybe Puss has found the error of his ways, found some humility. And this relationship kind of fluctuates depending on the situation. Sometimes they get closer, sometimes they get further apart. And I won't get into spoilers. I really do think that you should see this movie while it's still in theaters, because it is fantastic by and large. But this movie also has two other villainous entities, I guess. And I say entities because really there are 5 villains in this movie, and you'd see that and you'd be like, oh, that's a lot of villains. But really it's broken up into 3 villainous groups. The first one, Death, I already talked about. The second one is Goldilocks and the 3 bears. So that's 3 right there. But I kind of put them into one because they're a group, they're a family. And the take that this movie has on Goldilocks and the 3 bears is hilarious. I love it. They're this wannabe crime family. Goldilocks is kind of the brains of this outfit, but what really sucked me in is that they're not just a crime family that's all business all the time. They put the family in crime family, because at the end of the day, they are just a family. The crime stuff is more of just a hobby that they do. Really, Goldilocks has been adopted by these 3 bears, has been raised with them, and you really get a sense, and it's hilarious and heartwarming at the same time, just how awkward a family dynamic that is. And honestly, that is the most heartwarming part of this whole movie. It's the freaking Goldilocks and the 3 bears part that had me nearly crying as a grown man in the theater, because it was just so sweet. But the final villain in this story is Big Jack Horner. He's Little Jack Horner, you know, the nursery rhyme, Little Jack Horner sat in a corner. That weird little kid that used to stick his thumb in pies is now the owner of this Horner Pie Corporation, and he's massive. He gets really upset if you call him Little Jack Horner. He's now Big Jack Horner. He's got this complex where he's like, I gotta be big, I gotta be an adult, but he's got a baby face. The design on him is fantastic. It's funny. He is probably the most outwardly villainous person in this story, which is weird when you have a story that actually has the character of Death itself as a villain. But really, Death itself he's just doing his job. He's just doing what he does. Jack Horner is actually a terrible person. You see his office and it's like Lord Farquaad's dream, where you have all these fairy tale objects and fairy tale creatures captured or taxidermied in his office, and he's just acquired all these weird little trinkets over the years. And it's with him where all the references really pick up, and you're like, oh, I know what that is, I know what that is, I recognize that, because it's just a feast for the eyes. And he even has Mary Poppins' carpet bag that he puts all of his supplies in when he goes out looking for this wishing star. And over the course of the movie, he just keeps pulling stuff out from various fairy tales and stories, and you're like, oh, I recognize that, and the funniest that I kind of don't want to spoil, but it's just so good that if I do tell you, I think you just might enjoy it even more. But at some point in this movie, he pulls out a very familiar looking insect that I'm sure you're going to recognize right away. But as great as those interactions are on their own, and the writing is just hilarious, the voice that they give this thing is not the voice you might expect right away, but it fits so perfectly and is even funnier when you realize what kind of impression this person is doing. It had me laughing out loud. I might have been the loudest person in the theater of all these kids and parents. I was just dying when I heard this thing speak. And I'm just not realizing, well, maybe I'm hyping it up too much. Maybe you guys might not find it as hilarious as I did, but I loved it. And that's basically the movie. You have these three factions, Puss, Kitty, and their little therapy dog on one side, and then you have the three bears, and you have Jack Horner and his goons, all trying to get to this star in the middle of this map. All the while you have death kind of lurking in the background, becoming more and more relevant as the movie goes along, as this little extra looming threat that Puss has to deal with. And while that sounds like a lot to cram into just one movie, it's balanced surprisingly well. I feel like everybody had ample screen time. You get a sense of all their different personalities, their relationships. It's all developed very well, very efficiently. What I realized watching this is that each of these characters are so visually interesting and tell a story just through how they look and present themselves that they don't need a lot of screen time to leave an impression or to get what they're all about. You get what they're all about pretty immediate, and everything else is just to deepen their character development. And I can't believe I'm giving this much praise to a spin-off of a franchise that's only really persisted in meme culture for the past 5 years. And while it sounds like I'm giving this movie all the praise in the world, saying it's the best thing ever, there are still things in here that I actually kind of don't like. And I don't think it's so much this movie's fault. I just see these things as weird trends in the way children's animated films are going lately, and I'm not a fan. The first of which is there's a character in this movie, it's the little dog thing, and he actually swears in this movie. Now, for some context, the Shrek franchise has not been a G-rated franchise. It's PG. From the very first Shrek movie, they dropped some swears, some little crude language, but it's pretty mild. There's nothing that bad in them. But it does still have that little bit of an adult edge. So I'm not saying these movies have to be perfectly clean. It's just that when this dog swears a couple times in this movie, they have to bleep out what he's saying. You know how TV shows bleep out language because the FCC is gonna crack down on them. You can't be swearing on television. They use that same kind of ear-piercing beep to censor what he's saying. I just found that weird, especially because this is not the first time I've seen this done. Last year I went to the theater with my fiance and we saw League of Super Pets, and we both thought it was odd that you had this turtle character who swore, and she swore so harshly that they had to bleep it out in that movie too. I just found that so weird, because usually if a movie for kids, or families in this case, wants to make an adult joke, wants to use some crude language, and they're kind of written into a corner where they have to drop some real foul language, they'll usually write it where it uses a pun related to the world that it's in. Because this is the Shrek universe, they could have used fairy tale terminology to kind of substitute for bad words. And there you go, you have your little innuendo for adults, and the kids get to hear funny sounding words. So for me, relying on this censored bleep noise, one, it just hurts my ears. I just don't like hearing it. It kind of takes me out of the movie. But for me, it's just a sign of laziness that they couldn't find a more creative way to get across it, oh, this is a crude talking animal, without actually having them say the word that we all know they're gonna say, and then have to bleep it out for the sake of the kids. I just think there's a more creative way around that. And it's so weird for me to talk about laziness in this movie, because this movie, by and large, is not something I would consider lazy. There was a lot of thought and effort and creativity and ingenuity in how this movie was made. And just those little jokes, really threw me off, because I was like, oh, is that just what kids' movies are doing now? They don't have to actually take the time to write around swear words. They just say them and bleep them out, and oh, it'll make people laugh. And the second issue that I have with this movie, some of you might not even see this as a problem, it's just a personal preference thing for me, and it's that they use this Spider-Verse drop frame animation style when the action scenes really pick up, and it gets more fast-paced, frenetic, but it's also a little choppy. I personally am not a huge fan of that style. I think it worked fantastic in Spider-Verse. Can't wait to see Across the Spider-Verse. I think that is where that style belongs, because it's trying to emulate a comic book, the comic book aesthetic. And that's a very static aesthetic, but also very action-packed aesthetic. So I do appreciate how that works in that context. What bothers me is when they try to pull that into projects that don't necessarily need it. Because I saw it in The Bad Guys, and I didn't really care so much for that movie. I thought it was kind of disposable and lazy in some parts, but I really didn't appreciate the drop frame animation throughout the entire movie. It just was really distracting to me. And in this movie, to its credit, the majority of the film is animated in something closer related to the Shrek type of animation, your typical DreamWorks animation. It's just like clean, three-dimensional shapes moving pretty naturally. And it's really only when the big action set pieces go down and the energy picks up, that's when it turns into this Spider-Verse-y, more stylized drop frame animation. And there's even shots where they blend regular DreamWorks animation with that style of animation, and they're kind of layered on top of each other, where one character might be animated one way and another one a different way, and that's really weird to see. I didn't really know what to make of that choice. So for me personally, I prefer the cleaner, smoother animation because you can still make that go wicked fast. I think about Hotel Transylvania and how quick the animation is on that, and it looks good, it looks smooth. And I get the feeling that this kind of drop frame animation has only persisted because maybe it's cheaper to make. Maybe they think people will just associate it with Spider-Verse and they'll be like, oh, so it's good. But for any stylistic choice, you really have to think about what purpose is it serving, and is it better than the alternative? And for me, I would have preferred it if the movie just stuck to one animation style the whole way through, instead of trying to capitalize on what's popular in the time. Because I do believe that this style of animation over the next like 5 to 10 years, it will kind of fall away as this fad that kind of came and went. And it makes me wonder if in the future, when I'm showing this to my kids sometime in the future, this amazing movie that has so much character and personality will feel dated because of this stylistic choice. Well, dang, I don't want to end this movie on a negative note because I really did love this movie. I think it's really good, way better than it had any right to be. And it really kind of took me by surprise. I'd heard good things, but I'm like, okay, well, maybe they're overhyping it because, I don't know, we haven't had like a really good DreamWorks movie in a bit. But no, this movie is actually incredible. There's a lot of effort put into this. I was laughing hard throughout the majority of this movie because it has an incredible sense of humor, a non-stop pace. It's so efficient with its storytelling, but also it's not afraid to really earn that PG rating. That's something that, even though I complained about the swearing, there is quite a bit of violence that is used for the sake of comedy that really did remind me of the comedic style of the first 2 Shrek movies, where they weren't afraid to get a little gruesome, a little dark with its sense of humor. And while this movie doesn't have anything too objectionable, there are a couple moments where I'm like, that person died, and it's hilarious. So in that way, it does really earn that PG rating. It's not just this generic G-rated family romp. There are things in the movie where I'm like, oh, that might scare a kid a little bit, but in a good way. And that's not really something that we get a lot of. Even the later Shrek movies have kind of toned down the violence and the satire and the kind of mean-spirited edge that those first 2 movies had, that I really enjoyed. And I felt like this movie was a perfect return to form, and it scratched that Zorro Indiana Jones itch that I've had, and I just had a fantastic time. But now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Puss in Boots: The Last Wish? Have you seen it? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby, this is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.